you don't need a conception of, you don't need any kind of positive gloss on human sacrifice as a meme or as an archetype in order to form a coherent picture of the future that can motivate you. So delayed gratification is fully separable from a notion that it might ever be rational or good to sacrifice a child as an offering to an invisible other that doesn't exist.
But how do you know it's separable? Because that's the developmental history. As you said, the sacrifices
even if
came first.
I think it is in fact historically separable, but let's just say it's not. Let's just say it's a matter of our origins. They're united. They're of a piece. It is the genetic fallacy to care about that origin. I mean, to say that that is the only path forward toward a notion of the future, given where we've come from, or that it's somehow necessary to venerate now, or that it's good that we took that path.
But we do venerate the idea of sacrifice now. But I would say that
but
what's happened
I would say we do it to the detriment of our moral intuitions in the religious context. So, for instance, I think that the notion that Christianity is actually a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. Christianity is a religion that says, actually, no, human sacrifice is necessary, and there was only one that, in fact, was necessary and effective, and that's the sacrifice of Jesus. And I think that is, when you dig into the details, not only a morally uninteresting vision of our circumstance and how we can be redeemed, it's morally abhorrent. Okay. Right? So I think there's better versions online.
Let me ask you a question about that. So, in the moral landscape, you lay out this pathway. There's the bad life, and there's the good life, right? And you described what they were, and the bad life is a variation of hellish circumstances, and the good life is a variant of, hypothetically, the life that we would like to lead. And your conception is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, your conception is that the proper pathway forward, so that would be the moral endeavor, is to move away from the bad and towards the good.
Yeah, insofar as we understand which way is up, yes.
Yes.
The basic claim is that we can be right or wrong with respect to our beliefs there.
True. Yeah. We don't necessarily know how to do that in an unerring manner, and we could subject that to approximation correction along the way, and we should, but we can outline the broad scheme. Yeah. Which is progress away from hell towards something that's positive. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I would say that there's an implicit claim in that you should sacrifice everything in you that isn't serving that to that. And I would say that that's essentially the same claim that's made in Christianity.
Well, again, that is I understand the impulse to up-level these barbaric ignorance-derived beliefs, right, to something that is morally, that is interesting and palatable in the current context. And I understand you can do that. My concern there is you can do that with everything. I mean, you could do it with witchcraft. Why not do the exact same thing you're doing with religion to the history of witchcraft? Witchcraft is as well
modern
described.
Witches would do that. So that's a perfectly valid criticism.
That should be of concern. I mean, there are reasons why we don't want to endorse modern witchcraft, right?
Look, absolutely. And so one of your
But I mean, I'm not talking. And modern witchcraft currently exists. I mean, you go to Africa, people are hunting albinos for their body parts because they believe in sympathetic magic, and kids get killed as witches. So this belief endures in certain pockets of humanity, and we're right to. I mean, I just think at a certain point you have to acknowledge that some ideas are not only wrong, but their effects are disastrous, or have been disastrous, or will likely be, even if good in certain circumstances, will likely be disastrous in the future. And then we shouldn't be hostage to these ancient memes. We shouldn't have to figure out how to make the most of the worst idea that anyone's ever had, which is maybe you should sacrifice your firstborn child to a being you've never seen.
Hold on, Sam. I want to hold your feet to the fire here a little bit. 2 points. One, interesting observation. When you presented the example, so on your podcast I had argued believing that porcupines can throw their quills might protect you from a porcupine that might wheel around even though porcupines can't throw their quills. Your listener sent the better example, which was all guns are loaded. When you presented it, you didn't say all guns are loaded. Well, you said treat all guns as if they are loaded, which is, I think, the same reflex that you have faced with any metaphorical truth, which is that it can always be unpacked.
But actually, that's the way Jordan talks about believing in God as well.
Right, and actually, so this is. But then, if we take something like you say, all right, sacrifice of children is abhorrent. Let's say it is, and then you say, well, Christianity hasn't foregone the sacrifice of children. In fact, it's described one child who is sacrificed for everybody else. But arguably, that's an upgrade of some metaphorical truth that frees those who are adhering to this tradition from ever considering sacrificing a child. And what it does is it provides a motivational structure that may, in fact, have very positive outgrowths, though not literal, the idea that someone would have sacrificed their own child for the benefit of everybody else not to have to. That idea might engender a large amount of good work that would result, as Jordan is pointing out.
Let me just concede that the hardest case for me, I mean, which I did up top, just in defining, after you define metaphorical truth, and I use the gun example, there's certainly cases where the useful fiction is more useful than the truth. I would grant that, but I think those cases are few and far between. But handling guns is one of them. It's just not useful when the casino opens across the street and you can place $1 million bet, right? Then you want to have some purchase on the literal truth. So you want to be able to, and again, this is psychologically interesting because. And I keep coming back to the gun example because it's the one that is viscerally real to me. Like, if I have a real gun that I know to be unloaded, I still emotionally can't treat it as a harmless object. I can't point it at my child just for the fun of it because, that we're going to play cops and robbers now with a real gun, right? I have a superstitious attachment to always being safe with the gun, right? And it's important. It's important that get ingrained, and yet it is not strictly it's not irrational because it has good effects, but it's not actually in register with what I know to be true factually in each moment.
Right. So it's very low cost.
It's
very low cost.
It's very low cost. It's not dividing societies and causing people to go to war.
And if you were going to teach a child gun safety, you would want to encode this so that they would automatically know never to behave as if a gun is unloaded, because that's what gets you into trouble. As an adult, every gun owner recognizes the distinction between the metaphorical truth and the literal truth here. But I guess what I suspect is going on here is that your mechanism for dealing with the world involves unpacking all of these things. And I think it's highly productive. But it also means that you have a hard time understanding why anybody would do anything different. And that's the question, is just because we can track fully the difference between guns actually all being loaded and behaving as if all guns are loaded, right? That one, there's no leftover. There's no mystery there, right? But there may be many of these things for which there is some difficulty lining up the metaphorical truth with the literal truth, and operating according to the metaphorical truth might have advantages, which I think is what you're getting at.
So here's another situation, because we have to remember what kind of catastrophic past we emerged from and how much privation ruled the world prior to 1895, essentially. And certainly the farther back you go, the more bloody and horrible it was. I mean, how often do you think it was necessary, and this is not obviously something I'm in favor of, and this is also one of these situations where we get to play with ideas that we might not otherwise play with. How often do you think it was necessary for people in the past who had absolutely no access to birth control and who didn't have enough food to sacrifice a child for the survival of their family? I mean, God only knows, and that's, but that's worth thinking about. It's like, life is unbelievably cruel and difficult. And one of the problems that comes when you discover the future is that you might have to make the most painful of sacrifices. And lots of archaic people do this sort of thing. They do that with their elderly people. They do that with sick people. They do that with infants that they deem too fragile to survive. So part of child sacrifice, and I know the literature on child sacrifice reasonably well, part of child sacrifice seemed to emerge out of the observable necessity to leave someone behind so that everyone else didn't die. And we don't know how often that had to happen in the past. It might have had to happen a lot.
Right.
Now, obviously...
Although, just in the interest of kind of conceptual clarity here, human sacrifice is a larger horror than that. So you have, what was very common is the sacrificing of, captives. So you take the Aztec sacrifices where you now have slaves, some of whom you're going to...
Yeah, the Aztecs sacrificed about 25,000 people a year. Look, I mean, it's clearly a bloody mess. There's no doubt about that. But, one of the things that you see happening in the biblical narrative, which is extraordinarily interesting, is that you see echoes of child sacrifice at the beginning, but what happens is the sacrificial notion gets increasingly psychologized as the story progresses. So, you see that transition with Abraham and Isaac, where the child sacrifice is actually forbidden, although previously demanded by God. And then you also see it, as you already laid out, in the substitution of the circumcision for the idea of sacrifice itself. Right. And then what seems to happen, I'm trying to figure out how these ideas develop psychologically from their behavioral underpinnings, is that eventually it becomes psychologized completely. So you can say, well, we can conceptualize a sacrifice in the abstract, so my parents can sacrifice to send me to university without anything or anyone having to die. It transforms itself from something that's enacted out as a dramatic ritual into something that's a psychological reality. But all that blood and catastrophe along the way is part of the process by which the idea comes to emerge.
Right. So what is the connection of all of this? Because yes, so there is this history, and I would argue we are busily trying to outgrow much of it, if not most of it, whether it's evolutionary history or just the cultural history.
We might be trying to transmute it so that it becomes, we can maintain, as you've suggested we do, we can maintain what's useful in the tradition and throw out everything that's pathological.
Yes, but we're constantly discovering a lack of fit between both what we perceive in ourselves as biological imperatives and the cultural legacies of just what mommy and daddy taught me was true, right? Which we have now every reason to believe might not be true. And we're trying to optimize our thoughts and institutions and relationships with one another for our current circumstance. And yet we have this legacy effect of certain books and certain ways of speaking have a completely different status. And they have this status because they may, in fact, it's imagined, not be the products of merely previous human minds, but they may be the products of omniscience. And this is where the respect accorded to religious tradition is totally unlike the respect we would accord to anything else. Mythology, literature, past science, past philosophy. I mean, people can read Plato and Aristotle for their entire lives without ever being fully captured by the kind of dogmatism that every religion demands that you be captured by if you're really going to be an adherent.
I would say that's actually an archetypal truth. The idea that the pathological tradition stands in the way of update. That's an archetypal truth. I mean, one of the reasons why in creation myths, one of the variants of a creation myth is that the hero has to slay a tyrannical giant in order to make the world out of his pieces. And it's a metaphorical restatement of the idea that a tradition can become hidebound, and when it becomes hidebound and too rigid, that it interferes with current adaptation. But the problem is, and this is, I think, this is something we really need to hash out. The problem that you're describing is the problem of a priori structure. Now, some of that's textual, but some of it isn't textual. Some of it resides in us as our psyche, insofar as we act.
The problem I'm describing here is that we have two categories of books in this case, right? We have those written by people like ourselves, just endlessly open for criticism and conjecture, and those written by invisible, omniscient entities.
But I would presume that if these religious systems weren't codified in books, if they were still just enacted or dramatized, you'd have the same objection. It's not the fact that they're in books that's relevant.
Well, no, but it is the dogmatism. It's the fact that we can't jettison the bad parts.
Okay, it's the dogmatism. Okay, so to me, that's the same as the problem of structure. Now, here's the problem, I think, with the way that your argument is laid out. And I'm not saying it's wrong. It seems to me that this is a place where it needs to be developed, because I see that the attempt that you make to derive the world of value from the world of facts as justifiable given what it is that you're attempting to do, which in principle is to make the world a better place. But there's a massive gap in there. It's like, how do you do it? Because the objection that you place on my reasoning, let's say, which is, well, the problem with these texts is that there's an infinite number of interpretations, and which of them how can you determine which of those is canonically correct, is exactly and precisely the same criticism that can be levied against your attempt to extract a world of value from the domain of facts. It's the same problem.
Well, it's not an infinite number of interpretations in either case, but I allow
it's close enough to infinite so that...
Well, it might be. I mean, that's why the moral landscape for me is a landscape of peaks and valleys. And so, I'm totally open to the possibility, in fact, certainty, that there are different ways for similar minds, and certainly different ways for different minds, to be constellated so that they have equivalent but irreconcilable peaks on the landscape. So there's a lot of well-being over here, and there's a lot of well-being over here, and there's a valley in between. And so it's a kind of moral relativism. It's kind of like, this is great and this is great, but these are irreconcilable, right?
Well, I'd like to see that made more concrete, and I need to know how that fits in with your conception, because one of the claims that you make in the moral landscape is that the distinction between the bad life and the good life is not only it's a factual distinction.
Yeah.
It's universally apprehensible and true. I think it's your fundamental axiomatic claim. And I don't see how that's commensurate with the position that you just put forward.
Well, so here's the position. And you can forget about morality as a concept for this. I mean, I think the starting point is deeper than morality. The starting point, and this is our starting point, all of us right now in the universe. The starting point is we are conscious, right? We have a circumstance that admits of qualitative experience. And again, this is true however we understand consciousness, whatever is actually happening. We could be living in a simulation. This could be a dream. You could be a brain in a vat. Consciousness could just be the product of neurochemistry, or we could have eternal souls running on somehow integrated with the brain. Whatever is true, something seems to be happening. And these seemings can be really, really bad or really, really good. We know each one of us in our lives have experienced this range of possibility. And yes, there are caveats here. There are hard and painful experiences that have a silver lining, right, that give you some other capacity, where you could say, well, that really sucked, but I'm a better person for it, right? And we can understand what it means to be a better person for it in terms, again, of this range of experience, which I'm calling, subsuming all of this, the positive end of this as well-being, which is to say that I'm a better person for it because now, having endured that ordeal, I am capable of much greater compassion, or I appreciate my life more. The cancer made me a better person. Now that I'm cured, I value each moment of life more than I ever did. All of these claims are intelligible within a context of an open-ended context of exploring this space of possible experience. So what I'm saying is forget about morality, forget about right and wrong and good and evil. What is undeniable is that what we have here is a navigation problem. We have a space of possible experience. And again, this is not just a human problem, this is a problem for any possible conscious mind. We have a space of possible experience in which we can navigate, and things can get excruciating and pointlessly horrible, where there are no silver linings, and this can happen individually in some episode of madness that never ends. If there really is a Christian hell to go to, well, then it's going to happen to me after I die, right? Given what I've said on this stage, and so it matters who's right. Obviously, if I knew that an eternity of fiery torment awaited somebody who didn't make the right noises about one faith or another, well then it would only be rational to make those right noises, right? So it's my bet. I'm placing a bet on certain pictures of reality being wrong, but the reality is we're navigating in this space, and morality and ethics are the terms we use for how we think about our behavior affecting one another's experience. So if you're in a moral solitude, if you're on a desert island, or if you're alone in the universe, morality is not the issue you need to worry about, but well-being still is an ever-present issue. It's possible to suffer, and it's possible to experience bliss and perhaps something beyond that. And the horizon in both directions is something we'll never fully explore very likely. I mean, we don't know how good things can get, and we don't know how bad they can get, but that there's a spectrum here is undeniable. And I would say that my moral realism simply entails that we acknowledge that it's possible not to know what you're missing. It's possible to be living in a way where you are less happy than you could be, and not to know why, right? And just not have the wisdom to make the changes. And that matters. If anything matters, that matters. And it matters to us individually, and it matters to us collectively. And that mattering subsumes everything we can intelligibly want in this domain of value.